Hello. Welcome to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. I am your host, Luke Sheahan, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. Today's episode is sponsored by the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Today, I am joined by Timothy Goeglein, I believe. Tim is Vice President in External and Government Relations for Focus on the Family. Today, we'll be discussing his new book, Toward a More Perfect Union, the Moral and Cultural Case for Teaching the Great American Story. Tim has decades of experience in policy work, and a few have spent as much time and effort thinking about civic education as has Tim. Tim, thank you for joining me.
It's a real pleasure, Luke. Thank you for having me. It's great to be associated with anything having to do with the Kirk Center and the University Bookman, it's a real honor to be here.
Thank you. I want to start off with a definition. You're talking about civic education. What is civic education?
Well, I think in the broadest sense, it's this combination of understanding the American experience. And I think a great integration of it is the concept of the citizen. And how do we form citizens? How do we do that in a constitutional republic? It's not an overstatement at all, and I touch on this in my new book, Toward a More Perfect Union. As you know, it's not an overstatement to say that the founders had given the concept of the citizen an enormous amount of thought. And for as varied and truly diverse as they were, they felt very strongly that if you wanted to have freedom and liberty over time, that you had to foster virtue, both in the leaders and in the people, in the citizens. In fact, as different as these men and some women in this instance were in the founding generation, they believed very strongly that virtue, which is a bit of a fancy word, if I may say, for moral excellence. They felt that fostering and nourishing moral excellence in the civic institutions and the institutions of government and governance was very important. And so any non-governmental institution that helped to nourish this concept of good citizenship, of moral excellence in the people and the citizenry, that was the goal. And I think it's not an overstatement at all to say that if you walked in America today virtually into any corner of what we broadly call the public square, and you asked folks the question that you've asked me, this very fundamental question of civic ritual and the concept of the citizen, I think for many years it would sound kind of like a drawing room conversation, or maybe it's too stuffy or academic. But I think that's very unfortunate. I think that in the American experience, it's exceedingly important because our republic counts on it, that we have to be as serious as our founding generation was in this concept of the importance of the concretization, if I may say, of good citizenship. And it's one of the things, I'm glad you asked this at the top, because it's one of the things that really motivated me in writing Toward a More Perfect Union, that there's a moral and a cultural case to be made for teaching the great American story, not the least of which is helping to form and shape and impact and influence the rising generation of good citizens.
And let's unpack that a little bit. Think about what is it that how do we shape good citizens? You specifically talk about, and we're gonna get into this, civic ignorance and the failure to teach American history. But what is it about teaching American history and teaching the founders as they were, not according to an ideology going either way? What is it about that cultivates citizens?
Well, I think it's timeless. And I think that's frankly what makes the American story, our founding documents, so timely, topical, and relevant. To your very point, I was speaking very recently to a very large, well-known university. I'm sure that everybody who's joining us would know immediately this very, very well-known university. And I was speaking across 7 different class rooms, classes, I would say totaling 1,500 to 1,700 students. I began to ask very basic questions. Tell me, your view of the Third or Fourth Amendment. What is your view of the first article of the Constitution? I wasn't trying to trip up anyone. I was eager to know, very eager to know, in fact, their thoughts. And what was striking to me, Luke, and I say this frankly, as both a conservative and an eternal optimist, I was really struck by very basic ignorance on the biggest possible things. And in part, the reason that I asked those questions is that, as you know, from reading the book, that in the first third of the book, I jump headlong into the best empirical research on what Americans know, especially what young Americans know, what college graduates know. And as an inveterate optimist, I kept hoping, frankly, and praying that when I would study decade by decade, looking at very reliable empirical research, that I would see at least a bit of an upward trajectory and improvement. But in fact, as you know, it was and is quite the opposite. And I know that anecdotes are not statistics, but one of the things that I share in the book is that my friendship with the late great historian David McCullough, a really phenomenal historian. For those who are joining us, if they've not read books like 1776, his wonderful book on John Adams, you really owe it to yourself. Mornings on Horseback, about the formation of the young Theodore Roosevelt, Truman. These are very, very wonderful books. And the first time I met David and we formed a great friendship, I hosted him 3 times when I was working at the White House. And I asked him, just this is the first conversation we're having in a hallway at the White House. And he said to me, Luke, I'm suffering from insomnia. And I thought, gee, that's an unusual way to start a new friendship. And very serious. And as you know, in the book, I found a passage from his doctor who said, in fact, that David did suffer from insomnia, rooted in part in his meetings with members of the political class, going to campuses, and having this idea of historic and cultural and constitutional amnesia among a broad swath of our citizens, certainly not all, kind of dawn on you is a very sobering thing. And in the era of erasure culture, cancel culture, Wokistan, I think all of us who are conservatives and who remember now what seem to be the kind of prophetic warnings of really great men like Russell Kirk and that generation, very often and unfortunately, what they foresaw is the era that we are in. In other words, that we're not on the road to this kind of amnesia that I'm suggesting, but in fact that we're already there. And I think that is sobering, very sobering indeed.
Yeah, so you give a couple of anecdotes to illustrate this. You also provide the statistics, which are sobering to say the least. And this is, we should say, this ignorance is true of Harvard students and Harvard graduates. It's by no means limited to an uneducated part of our population. It's even the most educated are missing this basic aspect of civic education. A couple of things you talk about. NPR starts to tweet out lines from the Declaration of Independence, limited to 140 characters, of course. And the response is no one recognizes it.
I shared that because at first I thought this must have been a fairly small, sample survey. And as you know, from the book, it was just the opposite. That the most obvious parts of our great declaration, are a blank by very large numbers of people in our country. And as you know, Luke, that's just really scratching the surface. One of the things that I was really dumbfounded by was, and I use a lot of this research in the book. What I did, I was intrigued by the fact that for people who want to become legal immigrants, this series of very basic questions has routinely over the years been given to high school students, and the survey results year by year, decade by decade, are really shocking. And I just decided, thinking that we might be talking about this, I picked out very randomly just one data set, if I may share it with you. And then I want to go to the Harvard comment that you mentioned as well. This is a 2009 survey of Oklahoma public high school students. I mean, this is Oklahoma, and this is drawn, as I say, from the U.S. Citizenship test that all legal immigrants have to take to become citizens in our great country. I hope most of our people joining us this evening are sitting down, because these are really eye-popping stats. Only 1 in 4 could name George Washington as the first president of the United States of America. Only 10% knew that there are 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court. Less than 30% knew that the president heads the executive branch of our government. By the way, only 3%. I think this is what's important, Luke, in light of the questions that you've asked me, and especially that one. Only 3% were able to answer 6 out of the 10 questions, which, by the way, for those who don't know, that's actually the passing score for the U.S. citizenship test. And I think we have to absorb the practical reality of what this kind of empirical data set tells us. What does it tell us? I think it tells us that these students, some of them anyway, they're now in their early to mid 30s. They are casting votes. We're in the 21st century in America. They're attending rallies, and yet some of them are running and holding public office. Yet they are, in the main, woefully ignorant of our history and our system of government. You mentioned, and I think I'll do this very quickly. You mentioned the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. This is a very large survey for those of us who have spent a lifetime reading, absorbing, evaluating data. I was really taken with the ISI survey of 2008. And by the way, in the world of surveys and polling, this is a 2,500 person survey, which is a big survey. And only half of adults, Luke, in that ISI survey could name the 3 branches of our government. I mean, only half, including, by the way, and this is to the second part of your question, including only 36% of 4-year college graduates. Less than 20%, by the way, in the ISI survey, I think it was 18%, could not name a single right or freedom guaranteed under the United States Constitution. And the highest performing school on the ISI civics test, as you said, was administered by ISI, was at Harvard University. And by the way, whose students scored under 70%, which of course, even in the era of great inflation, is like a D+. So these are very sobering statistics. We have a lot of work to do. And the point of my book is not to say, here's all the problems. The point of the book is to say, here are the problems. What are we going to do about that? And then, as you know from the book, to spend a third of the book saying, here are some things that we ought to think about and things we ought to think about implementing.
Now, this civic ignorance, we saw it kind of in full display in the disaster that was the summer of 2020. Yep. So a real low point in American politics. And yes, you talk about how this civic illiteracy contributes to our toxic politics. And there was some some very good examples of how that was the case. And some of the most disturbing aspects of that low point in 2020 was the destruction of monuments and
Yes.
statues. Can you walk us through some of these examples?
I'd be happy and unhappy to do so at the same time. So let me use just some sort of armchair examples. Our office in Washington, D.C., Focus on the Family's office, is very close to Hillsdale's office, the Heritage Foundation on Massachusetts Avenue, very, very close to the United States Senate, the Capitol building, the Supreme Court. I mean, we're in the monumental core of the heart of our federal government. And 3 blocks from the Heritage Foundation, from Hillsdale, from our office, 3 or 4 blocks, is, I think, the second most famous statue or artwork or monument of Abraham Lincoln in our capital city. It is a beautiful, unprecedentedly beautiful a monument. And it was paid for, commissioned and paid for by emancipated slaves. And it's a beautiful depiction of the 16th president of the United States. And you can see the slaves, the emancipated, unshackled slaves, who are just having this remarkable moment with the our primary commander in chief of the Civil War. And in fact, Luke, this is such an important piece of artwork that Frederick Douglass spoke there. And I am still without words to describe the iconoclasm of that particular summer, having watched it in many iterations with my own 2 eyes, to have a group of Capitol Hill citizens, many of them Black Americans, who were joining hands, locked tight, surrounding the monument to keep it from being vandalized. We had another incident in Washington, very close, by the way, to D-Day, where the World War II memorial was vandalized. A lot of us have family ties to World War II. I had 4 uncles who fought in World War II. Praise God, they all came back. And I could go on and on. I'll tell you what, one of the most shocking things in the time since the book has been out was a visit I made to California. And I'm in this very large auditorium in California. And I'm asking a very large group of high school and college students, how many of you are natives of California or have spent significant time of your life in California? Forest of hands. Put your hands down, please. Okay. How many of you know who Father Sarah is? And Luke, in this forest of previous hands, admitting their California, connections, one person knew who Father Sarah is, the founder of California, the kind of ingenuity, genius behind the missions, that really set the precedent for this remarkable and beautiful state. And yet he's been categorically erased. I have lived for 35 years in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We live a stone's throw comparatively from Mount Vernon. Praise God, it's in private hands. We are watching ancestral homes of some of our greatest presidents be essentially taken over. People forget that Madison is the primary architect of our Constitution. Wasn't even, I think, even 45 or 46 years old under that. That's amazing. Jefferson, under the age of 35 in the drafting of the Declaration. One last anecdote, forgive me. I was speaking as well during the book tour in another public forum, mentioned actually World War II. It was overwhelmingly young people there, and mentioned Winston Churchill. And for those who do any public speaking, you know that after you speak, people come up to the podium and sort of kibitz about what you said, agree or disagree. And I had a sizable number of young people come up and say, wow, Winston Churchill, what an interesting, figure. And they clearly had not heard of him, So I think this is how late we are in the game. And I think we as conservatives have to do something very important, which is we have to, I think, successfully answer the question, what are we going to do about this? Because it's not It's not like we're moving toward this or we're going in that direction. Alas, I think we've arrived there. And I think we've all, Luke, had these very unusual experiences where we're in a cocktail conversation, or we're at a university or a college or a think tank or on the street or in our neighborhood, and we make a reference, a reference that we all in Western, those of us who love Western civilization, will make a reference, to this personage or that speech or that play or that piece of music, and we assume that the people, that the person we're speaking to, or people that we're speaking to, have that common reference point, and increasingly in substantial numbers, that's just simply not the case.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about this decline. Kind of, when did it go wrong? There was a time when you could have those conversations you just mentioned, and most people would know what you were talking about. If you mentioned George Washington, they knew he was the first president. They knew he had led the war, the American troops in the War for Independence. They had the basic outline, even if they didn't know, they weren't scholars. What happened? When did this go wrong?
I'm glad you asked, because that was one of the questions that really bedeviled me in thinking about conceptualizing and researching this book, and then writing it. And we all want to begin from a stance of maybe it's bad parenting, or maybe it's bad teaching, or and I certainly think that in some or certain instances, it's not just one answer, and those things could certainly and probably are contributing factors. But what I found, and I think this is very important to say, maybe the most significant thing that I can suggest in our conversation, is that my conclusion is that the constitutional and historic cultural ignorance that we're discussing in this great conversation, I think is pretty willful. I think it was a proactive decision on the part of a number of people and institutions who had developed what I would consider to be a kind of tangible animus to the United States and to Western culture. And I think that, and I can use one example, and I think the most prominent example, as you know, I devoted an entire chapter to his infamy, is Howard Zinn. I'm eager to say this, if I may, because you and I, we say Howard Zinn, and you and I, and probably most or all the people joining us on this webinar, we have a foundational sense of who Howard Zinn was. But I think, Luke, it is very fair to say that out of this kind of rather small concentric circle, people don't. I have mentioned his name endlessly in many talks, lectures, interviews regarding Toward a More Perfect Union. And I am always genuinely surprised by the very large number of people who have no idea who Howard Zinn is, and they did not know that he wrote the single most influential, in air quotation marks, American, history textbook, in the history of our constitutional republic. And that narrative of animus against the American story, against Western culture, against Western civilization, has now, unfortunately, become the predominant narrative. And a lot of us, have spent a lot of time doing our best to read everything that Howard Zinn wrote. And it is really heartrending when you read some of the ways in which I mentioned World War II earlier. I'm not really on a World War II kick, but it's worth saying, I guess, in light of the anniversary of D-Day and upcoming Independence Day. And, here we are, we're Americans, we're between Memorial Day and Independence Day. So maybe that is a good thing, but it's readily accessible to us. And, he references America's entree into World War II in a rather stunning manner. And for those of us who have those kind of either familial or community ties, you realize this is very bad history, And as you know, in the book, I say, I think it's perfectly great to be a person who has a rightist view or a leftist view, and to be a great historian. I actually think Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote some very important histories. I love his Age of Jackson. I understand he comes from a particular viewpoint. By the way, Arthur made that very clear. One of his later books on what was happening and kind of, prophetically, I might say, about the age of multiculturalism. A man of the left, but he was very open and shared a lot of our presuppositions about what could happen. And I think we've come to see it. I mentioned Paul Johnson, a great conservative historian, John Lukács. These were really remarkable people. They had definite views. There's no doubt about that. But the difference, Luke, is they were very open about their views, and they knew that they owed it to the reader to say, what their view was. And I think those of us who have been friends or readers, beneficiaries of their history, I think that's fully between the 40-yard lines. But when you read Howard Zinn-like history, you realize that this person is a neo-Marxist, and that much of what he is writing, much of it is irredeemably flawed. And he moves us away from fact-based history and fact-based senses of culture. And he moves us into balkanization, tribalization, the things that we as conservatives, really abhor. I mentioned, as you know, at length, write about the 1619 Project. I think I've read everything that its creator, has now written. And it's irredeemably flawed again. I don't speak this way as a person, but it's a lie. I mean, it really is. To say that America was born in 1619 when the slave ships came to the coastlands of what became the Commonwealth of Virginia is just bad history. It's not how slavery came to North America. And it's certainly definitively not the birthday of the United States of America. And yet, Luke, I'm very sorry to say, that 1619, you may know, is now being taught in 4,500 schools. I was, by the way, speaking to a group today, a large group of young people here in Washington, and one of the young women who was there told me that 1619 is the predominant history that is being taught both in her former high school and in her college. So I think we are, and of course it's been adapted, 1619 has been adapted for Hulu, and that's what Howard Zinn patterned. He found a way to get his bad ideas into elementary school, middle school, high school, universities and colleges. The left is very good at this, and it's been very destructive.
Yeah. So, and there are a great many very prominent historians objected to the 1619 Project, and a number of them were figures on the left. This was not about an ideology or an affection for the founding. It was about the fact that it was just wrong. It's just not what happened.
Yes.
And it was extraordinary.
It was extraordinary. And if I may, and I mean just very quickly, I knew we were going to be having our wonderful dialogue tonight, and I found what I think is maybe the defining quote of Nicole Hannah-Jones. Of course, she's the primary author of 1619. And this is very quick. It's 2 sentences, but she says the fight over the 1619 Project is not about history. She said it is about memory. Now, may I say, Luke, I think on that one we may agree. In other words, it's really the left's attempt to redirect the Mississippi River. You know what I'm saying? It's really their attempt to foist ignorance, willful ignorance, proactively, to erase the memory of the United States of America, and then to create a new history, but using cognition, right, as the kind of crafty way to manipulate. And I think that, if I may say, is in large measure what we are seeing now. We have lived through at least since the 1960s, and some would say rightfully, dating back to the progressive era. And, we could talk about that as well. But just for purposes of our conversation this evening, today, I am particularly interested in this willful rechanneling, because all of our major cultural institutions now are in the hands of progressives, and it is not too much to say for the differences they may have within the progressive camps, and they certainly do, and those are important differences to your earlier point about otherwise, responsible historians. But I think that this kind of dangerous and I do think it's dangerous, this kind of willful lying, willful misrepresentation, willful manipulation, is everything, and it's everything that our conservative forebears warned us against. Bill Buckley in God and Man at Yale, Russell Kirk in The Conservative Mind, T.S. Eliot in many of his most powerful essays of literary criticism, cultural criticism, was talking about the ramifications of precisely the cultural moment in which we find ourselves.
And let's talk a little bit about, because you talk about, we should teach American history, the great American story, but also its flaws. And I think it is kind of helpful to focus on that, because I think what you see with the 1619 Project, it would be kind of the equivalent on the right as if we told stories about Washington and said he in fact never lied, and he told the truth when he cut down the cherry tree. Then we would look at that with great annoyance. You're telling stories that aren't true. Tell the truth about Washington. And I think we're really missing something there. So elaborate a little bit on telling the whole story.
More than you possibly know, I'm very pleased by this point, because in the very early 1990s, a person who you and I know quite well was kind enough to arrange for me to spend a whole day with the great publisher Henry Regnery and his wife at their summer home in Michigan. And I remember many things from that extraordinary meeting. But the most important thing I remember was Henry Regnery speaking to me about the very early battles of ideas over World War II, major differences over FDR, major differences over Churchill, major differences over Pearl Harbor, major differences about American foreign and security policy and the way that conservatives, understood that. That part of our conversation launched in I remember a wonderful conversation with Henry on the nullification crisis and the United States Civil War, the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. In other words, conservatives, we do one great big thing, I think, very well, and that is we are not afraid of saying that we are comfortable with imperfection. We understand that there is no perfect country. There was only one perfect person, Jesus Christ. But because there is no perfect country, culture, or civilization, conservatives are quite comfortable saying, okay, so let's delve into the facts. Let's be comfortable with the facts wherever they take us. And then let's draw from this kind of toolbox of fact-based history and culture, let's try to say what it actually was. Let's be comfortable sharing, a multiplicity of viewpoints. And what is so disturbing about Howard Zinn's multiple histories, what is so disturbing about 1619 is that in kind of cartoon characters, they kind of suggest that there's kind of one think in America, and that in all of these dynamic periods, the pre-founding, the founding, the era leading up to the Civil War, Reconstruction, the era before World War I, World War II, the social and moral revolution of the 1960s, the Reagan era and the Cold War, that somehow there's really only one narrative viewpoint in the United States. And this is, I think, as I say, really unforgivable. It's incomprehensible. Conservatives, I think, have said, from the beginning, and we have great, conservative historians or historians who are conservative have always warned about precisely what you're asking. And here we are. And in the era of social media, right? And in the era of cultural dominance by one ideology, it becomes a very Herculean effort simply to tell the truth.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about, knowing the truth about a man like Washington, for example. What was great about him was not that he was somehow born without the capacity to lie. What was great about him is that he was a human being like you and I, but he worked and worked on his character. He was extraordinary in having an incredible insight into his own flaws. He had a really bad temper, and he knew it, and he worked and worked and worked to get it under control. And that's what, you can learn a lot from his life precisely because he was human. He had the good side and the bad side. And yeah, your point about thinking there was a single narrative. We only need to know about the relationship between Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison to know that this is not true at all.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to pick up on two of your points, if I may, because I think they're so well stated. The first is, and I'm eager to share this story. When my book first came out at the turn of the year, I was invited to let's call it a dialogue in an otherwise quite left-wing venue, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really did. And about 3/4 of the way through, it wasn't really a debate, but it was a discussion of of great differences. I turned to my interlocutor and I said to her, I have a very simple question to ask you. There's all the audience. Gosh, what's he going to ask? I said, this is actually quite easy to ask. I said, do you think it is possible objectively to define greatness in a man or a woman? In other words, if you and I can completely agree, you as a progressive, I as a conservative, if we can agree, that there is such a thing as greatness, are you comfortable, standing here, saying this person was great? And it was really quite a defining moment, because it was, I'm not overstating it. I think my interlocutor, my friend, we became good friends. She was quite unwilling to say that there was any such thing as objective greatness. And I posed to her the questions that you might imagine. I said, do you believe that we can objectively say that Cicero is a great figure of history? Can we objectively say, I used your example, George Washington, do you believe he's a great American? I further said, do you believe that Thomas Flexner, the great historian, was correct, that he was the indispensable man? No George Washington, very difficult to see how we have a United States. I said, for all the flaws that she had suggested on Madison, did he create a great document, helped to as the primary architect, not solely, in the United States Constitution? And she's very, very uncomfortable answering any of those questions. So I think it's in one sense, Luke, even beyond over arguing, rightfully understood, or debating the narrative. I think we are up against something else, which is a kind of nihilistic moral relativism that even our friends on the left, and I mean friends, are unwilling, to even concede ultimately that the Constitution is a great document, that the United States is a great country, and I could go on and on. So I think to your first point, that's deeply concerning. But the second one I think is even more concerning, and it's the following: it is that we no longer can find even approximate agreement on what is the definition of a great citizen. What kind of generation are we working together to form and shape, to stand to be the leaders in the next generation? And it's dawned on me, and I talk about this in the book, that whoever wants the next generation, I think, is going to get them. And I think progressives have the equivalent of a minor league and a major league. They have a trajectory that very early on helps to define talented young men and women, and it finds a way of bringing them through that system so that when they get their spot at home plate, they are prepared, to hit and run. And I think American conservatism has extraordinary institutions. And I mean extraordinary institutions, beginning with the Kirk Center, beginning with ISI, the ones we've talked about. Terrific, period. But it's organized very differently than the progressive left, which actually identifies young people very early on and almost hand selects in one sense, and finds a way to move them forward to become the leaders of cultural institutions that can help deepen this kind of debate over the narrative and the memory of our country that we've been discussing.
What can we do here to improve the situation we're in?
Engage. I travel about a third of the time. And Luke, here's my confession of the night. I meet large numbers of fellow conservatives, large numbers, men and women of faith, who say something like, I'm just trying to keep my head down. I just am trying to protect my family. I don't like all that. I don't want to get involved. If they come to Washington, the last thing they want to do is visit a politician. They want to come for various reasons. That's not true of our friends on the left. They want to fully engage, and they train up, as do many of our wonderful groups on the right. They systematically train up young people in substantial numbers, to engage. And so it concerns me because the progressive left counts on the apathy of conservatives who are exhausted by the cultural battles. In the era of social media, they don't want their reputations to be destroyed. They don't want their professional bona fides to be undermined. They're very concerned about their children. And this is the principal reason that I'm so hopeful, because I think we are actually seeing a parental and a grandparental rebellion in substantial numbers. For the first time, people are saying in large numbers, what's a school board? How can I run for the school board? What does the school board do? Who determines the curriculum, in my child's classroom? All these kind of first principle questions that we as conservatives think are so valuable. And I think that the parental and the grandparental rebellion that I'm suggesting is measurable, it's tangible. I think it's deep and wide. And I think it's happening not just in so-called red America. I think it's happening in blue and purple America too. People may not share our suppositions on a lot of things, but they are coming to see that they feel that they're losing their country.
I think you're right. I saw a study recently that people used to know the prominent members of their community, and that's no longer true. But it seems to be people have realized they don't know who they are, and then these terrible things happen in their local schools, and they realize that's what they need to do, and they're engaging again in that. And I think it is widespread. It seems to be happening many different places across the states, blue and red. Rural and urban and so on. I do want to hit on a couple of major figures that you brought up, and I actually didn't know the story about Chief Seattle, and I want to touch on that. Can you tell his story?
I'm so glad you asked. I was in Seattle, just in the last year, and this is before my book came out, and I was, of course, had researched quite a bit about this remarkable American figure, and as per my comments early in our conversation, I was asking people I met with, tell me what you know about the namesake. They know nothing. He is a figure is totally erased. If we did not have the great figure of Chief Seattle, we probably would not have the Pacific Northwest in quite the way that it has come to us. He was such a talented leader of two major tribes, and I am extremely impressed, and I think all of us should be impressed by this kind of monumental achievement. He leaves an incredible legacy of achievement in that part of our nation. And I kept asking myself, why on earth do we not know more about the namesake of one of our most important cities in the Northwest. And I came to see, as I say in the book, that lo and behold, he had been a slaveholder. And it turns out in the era of Wokistan that if you own slaves, it could be one slave, it could be multiple slaves. And by the way, it is a sin, it is evil, it is flawed, it is wrong, period. But it categorically. But if and no exceptions. But if you have been a slaveholder, ipso facto, you are relegated to potential erasure. And I think that that's precisely what has happened to Chief Seattle. And may I say, Luke, I think, and I'm very glad you asked about this, one of the things that's important is that I think a real dereliction of duty is, why do we not have a major biography about this person? Why don't we have movies? An important movie. We seem to find the cachet for biographies, profiles, documentaries, full-length features, on other, important figures. Why not Chief Seattle of all people? And I think, at least in part, it's because of this part of his past. There's so much more to this man, I think that we're honor bound to evoke this great figure.
And there are several others we could talk about. I think we just mentioned in passing Frederick Douglass. And some of these figures, I think you mentioned that Frederick Douglass statue was defaced in the infamous summer of 2020. But who is Frederick Douglass?
Frederick Douglass is actually one of my heroes. By the way, I'm a native Midwesterner, even though I've lived and worked in Washington for more than 35 years. And I have recently, in the last 2 years, learned that Frederick Douglass, who was a prolific speaker, actually visited Hillsdale College, I think 2 or 3 times, and I think substantially before the Civil War. He was the most photographed figure, more than Lincoln, of the 19th century, an incredibly important voice for the rightful kind of understanding of justice, social justice. A person who is one of our greatest figures, and who I think you can buy stock in Frederick Douglass because it's only going to go up. And I believe very strongly that his friendship with and counsel to Lincoln was very important. His reflections on the meaning of the Civil War, his reflections on slavery as a former slave himself, the idea of the educated person, the idea of personal responsibility, the idea of the importance of travel and speaking up and speaking out. Frederick Douglass, and by the way, what an immeasurably gifted writer and orator. Yes, I think that as with Chief Seattle and with so many other figures that I mentioned in the book, as a conservative, I think it's really a great project for the rising generation of young conservatives to go back to some of these figures who have not had 9 million books written about them, and to say, let's do another kind of project. Let's reintroduce, based on character, ingenuity, all the things that we hold most precious, achievements, immovable standards, timeless style. Let's apply all of those unchanging, unwavering principles and virtues, and let's go introduce to the next generation of Americans, another group of remarkable men and women. I think that would be a great project.
Well, and Frederick Douglass is a perfect example of the importance of our classical education, I guess you might say. He taught himself, was self-taught for the most part, and he used basically a rhetoric textbook that was speeches from the classical world. And so here he is, this classically educated ex-slave, and then he's enormously influential. But he really is the personal embodiment of why that education is so important. It was Frederick Douglass. You want to be like Frederick Douglass? You need the education Frederick Douglass had.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Here in Washington, we've had a very important national debate at Howard University, which is one of our historically Black colleges. And the debate in that university has been whether to erase and get rid of the classics. or whether to retain them. And I'm very happy to say that there is a rearguard action underway to continue to make the case for teaching the classics to everybody, because they're for everybody. They are, if you're the least educated person or the most educated person, regardless of where you've come from, regardless of your background, etc. These are monumental, and colossally important figures. I mentioned Cicero earlier. We need to reintroduce these great figures of history, and I think it's. I'm very hopeful. I feel confident it's going to happen, because I think there's going to come a moment, Luke, where the next generation of young Americans are going to realize that they've been robbed of their own legacy, their own patrimony, both in the American experience and story, as I say in the book, and in Western civilization. And the more that they discover these great figures, they will say, wait a minute, that has nothing to do, with all the things that these progressive ideologues have said. So this is an incredible figure, and I've got to know more about what they've written, who they are, and above all, what they've postulated. That's very important.
We're going to open up to questions from the audience. So do write any questions you have for Tim in the chat. I do have a couple more things I'd like to discuss.
Sure.
Actually, this is where I get a little fanboyish, as Frederick Douglass and George Washington and figures like that. But I think you're right that there's something about the inspiration of their stories. It has a role, so learning the history the right way has a role in character formation. So you take Washington, he had his flaws, and he worked on them. Spent his entire life working on getting his temper under control. And he had, several famous incidents where he loses his temper on Charles Lee in the battlefield. He would lose it to his cabinet because they'd always be bickering. There's various times where and he was aware that he had this flaw, and he would destroy him if he didn't take it under control. And he worked and worked and worked to make sure that he could do that. And another thing he's often criticized is not being a genius, which he was not. And he was well aware of it. And he took his general's counsel. He'd listen to them, he'd think it through, and then he'd make a decision and take responsibility for it. It was kind of classic case of not letting the ego get in the way. And Washington was in so many ways just kind of a paragon of character, and he crafted his character in that way over time.
You are so correct. I must tell you, I had a friend who's now retired, who was the chief curator of the Library of Congress. And in the era before the National Archives were established and built, most of the US presidents who were president before the archives was established and built, many, not categorically, by the way, but in large numbers, their papers remain in the collection of the Library of Congress. And my friend invited me, knowing that I was such a great fan of the founding generation, to spend the better part of a day reading the letters, the diary entries, etc., of many of our founders. And I must tell you, and I do mean this, it brought tears to my eyes to read these entry writings of Washington when he's very, very young, and he's essentially, as you say, he is habituating himself to virtue. He is habituating himself to high character. He's very honest, about the things that constitute a great man, and he understands that he has a moral obligation, to be a person of great virtue and character. And this is in the best sense, this is a preoccupation all of his life. I remember, it's not in the book, but I remember reading most of the histories of Forrest MacDonald, one of our really great historians. And Forrest spoke about the importance in the 18th century of assuming your mask and wearing it, and this is a great idea from antiquity. This is the man I intend to be. My actions define who I am. And now I'm going to go be that man. It's a marvelous concept, and I think it's as relevant in the 21st century of America as it was in the 17th and 18th century, in our pre-founding and our founding era as well. And I agree with you. It's a good thing to be mesmerized by George Washington, because he was and is a remarkable figure in all of Western history, and he will matter as much in 1,000 years as he does today.
Well, I agree. He'll be one of the few figures we talk about the way we talk about Cicero or
Yes,
Alexander the Great, or
yeah,
these sorts of figures.
yeah.
Yeah.
My friend, I don't mind saying George Washington was one of our great retreaters. And I'm not going to carry a metaphor, but in the world of great character, understanding that you may not in life move forward every single day, that sometimes the vicissitudes of life cause us to take a step back or a step sideways. And he had unlimited numbers of failures and disappointments, real failures, but isn't it incredible that this array of Americans, from Adams to Jefferson to Gouverneur Morris, I could go on and on, Abigail Adams, all these people, various from different parts of the country, different vantage views, they all came to the conclusion that Washington may have been the greatest man they ever met.
Right.
It's rather incredible.
It is. Now, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the 1776 Commission report. Could you talk about that a little bit?
It's a very substantial part of the book. I hope I'm its number one cheerleader. If I'm not, I want to be, because one of the most recurring questions that I have had since the book has come out is, what can we do about it? Yes, here are the problems, and we want something better. What can we do? And I believe that it's very important to counter 1619, to counter Howard Zinn. And I think, very honestly, Luke, I think that the 1776 project has achieved it. I think it's that good. I think that it is the best single curriculum that I am aware of for all Americans to understand the great American story. It's comfortable with the timeline. It's comfortable with a chronology. It's not ideologically left-wing. It's not ideologically right-wing. It doesn't seek to be. It seeks to do the old-fashioned thing, to tell the truth. And it goes through systematically, in a beautiful, powerful, eloquent way, the story of America, in a way that if you are young, if you're middle-aged, if you're old, and you either want a refresher course or you're learning our great American story for the first time, you can go through the 1776 and say, that is great. And I think I've recommended it, numerous times, limitless numbers of times, because I think it's that good and it's that reliable. And I think it's precisely the kind of thing that we need to have in local schools. We need to have it in private and parochial and non-sectarian, sectarian schools. We need to have it in homeschooling. And I think it's going to catch on. It already is. But I think it's a fantastic tool in our toolbox.
And I want to read here this is a question that came from a viewer. The viewer writes, some conservatives are expressly giving up on institutions of higher education as a lost cause. Is that a prudent position to take in 2023?
No, I think not. We all know, our fellow conservatives, some say those are irredeemably flawed institutions, and so disengage. Stand back. I disagree. Just in the last few years, I've spoken at many of our great elite institutions. I say that with humility, not with arrogance. I'm stunned, Luke, by the number of young conservatives who are making their way in otherwise overwhelmingly progressive institutions. Spoken at Adams House at Harvard, have spoken 2 or 3 times at Yale University, in the law school, formerly Bolt Hall, at Berkeley, at Stanford, very recently at the University of Chicago, and I am overwhelmed in the best way, with this strong sense of a conservative presence, beachhead, in otherwise very deeply flawed institutions. I spoke at the State Department. This is the State Department, for heaven's sakes, the so-called striped pants crowd. And I was stunned by the number of young conservatives there, who believe in our institutions and want to make a difference. So I think we should not disengage from our elite institutions. I think we have to believe in our institutions, and we have to do everything we can, not just to be repelled or to respond to them, but we have to actively work, to reform them. Isn't that the conservative challenge? We're not the rebels, we're not the revolutionaries. Our goal, Burke, right, is to we reform in order to preserve. So I think we have to encourage our young people to follow their dreams, and if their vocations take them to elite institutions or otherwise American institutions, we need you there. And groups like the Federalist Society, groups like the Kirk Center, ISI, Heritage, I can go on and on. ADF, Focus on the Family. We are working overtime to prepare our young people, and so I think we have a very wonderful series of programs that are not anti-institutional. I think we have to believe in the country. We believe in the Constitution. We want something different. So buckle up.
All right. Well, Tim, this has been a great conversation. Where should people go to find out more about you and your work?
I would be very pleased for people to have a copy of the book, and the best place that they can get it is faithfultext.com. That's my favorite, because they're not anti-conservative. And they believe in the Bill of Rights and all the things we've talked about, and I've gotten to know the people there. Of course, Amazon.com, every single one of the places that people normally buy books, the book is easily gotten. It's already in its second printing, praise God. And I think it is because in this era of erasure and cancel culture, I think it's come into the body politic, as it were, at a time when people are really thinking about and very deeply concerned about the things that we've talked about tonight. And so I really encourage people to read it, to share it, and to help us get the word out. I'm very pleased to say, and I say this again with humility, that our friends at Hillsdale were kind enough to invite me to speak, and I did, and C-SPAN showed up, and it's been shown many times, the book talk that night, and it's been reshown and so forth. And I think that that's a good resource because you've asked to point people in that direction as well. But I love this idea, Luke, of Toward a More Perfect Union. That's why I chose the title, because it's not that we are a perfect union, right? It's in my view, a supremely humane view toward a more perfect union. And I love that view. And I believe that great days are ahead for our country, because when you meet young people, I spend a lot of time with them, you realize that this is a generation impatient for all the right things. They want something better, and they need places like Kirk and Focus and many of the groups I've talked about tonight. And so I think we're stepping up and doing our best.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you to our sponsors, the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center. You can support the Kirk Center and the work of the University Bookman through the Kirk Center website at kirkcenter.org/donate. Go to kirkcenter.org/permanent-things. Sign up for the Kirk Center website, and stay tuned and pay attention to the University Bookman emails. We will be having more episodes every month through the summer and fall of the book gallery. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Luke.